This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
It's Friday the 17th of January, and this is the Friday morning break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week is Claire Lawler, Programs and Networks Manager at the Imperial War Museum. Claire has also worked at the National Portrait Gallery and has worked in Holocaust education. Today, we are going to discuss making the most of a museum visit.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And we're back as the music dies away on Friday morning with Teachers Talk Radio. And you're listening to John Gibbs, the Friday morning break. And as I said in the introduction, my guest this week is someone I've been looking forward to talking to, because we're going to talk about something I love doing, going to museums. And I even love going to museums with the students over the years, as we were talking about with my guest, Claire. Oh, sorry, I should say I jumped to it quickly. My guest, Claire, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me.
I was starting to go off on one there and reminisce. I do that. Now, Claire, as I said, you are the Program and Network Manager. You've worked in museum education, and you're currently at that wonderful museum, the Imperial War Museum.
That's right. Yeah. So, my role is kind of primarily in learning and engagement in that department within the museum. And I'm responsible, along with many colleagues, in producing programmes for a variety of museum audiences, but primarily schools audiences.
Yeah. Have you, I mean, that's interesting. You use the word programmes. Is that something that schools, well, let's start, actually, I'll jump to that. I'm going too far ahead. Claire, what would you say the role of a museum education for you is, and how did you get into this role?
Yeah, so for me, the role is you're responsible for producing programmes, as I said, and for a variety of audiences, and particularly with schools audiences that include both primary and secondary schools. And obviously, given the nature of the collection at IWM, that's primarily focused on the history curriculum, but we get students, studying all sorts of different subjects. So I'd say the skills that you need to do a role in museum education at any museum is having an awareness not only of the collection of the museum that you work in, but also an awareness of the national curriculum and trends in pedagogy, but also, the challenges that, teachers are currently facing, and just having that awareness and a finger on the pulse in terms of what's going on in schools. But also there's another element to it as well in terms of project management skills and stakeholder management, and working with variety of different stakeholders. And I kind of see my role as almost translating the museum and the interpretation of the exhibitions for specific audiences, in this case, schools, because for a lot of our students who are visiting us, and this has become really apparent kind of post-pandemic, is that when they step through the doors on a school trip, highly likely that's the first time they may have ever stepped through into a museum or a gallery. And so what I hope to do with my work alongside my colleagues is produce really kind of memorable learning experiences that are relevant to what they're studying in school, but also fun and memorable, and hopefully giving them the confidence and the agency to go on to engage with museums and galleries later on in life.
Yes.
So it's kind of, we're catching them at a really key moment in their learning journey.
That's such a good point. I mean, I have been in museums with students where they've seen a thing, an artifact, which is directly relevant to something they've been doing in class. and you can see the dots joining up, and it is wonderful. And I've got to say, it's often enhanced by the brilliant work of education staff and education officers at the museum. Often have all the skills of a teacher and a deep knowledge of the artifacts and the museum itself. Did you go into museum education from being a teacher?
So I did seriously consider the PGCE, and then I have a friend who is a science teacher, and he said, if you do a PGCE, you will cry in front of people you never thought you would cry in front of. I was like, okay.
Yes.
And then I actually discovered that there was MA in museum studies. And so I went on to do that after university. And one of the modules within that was around education. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. So it's that kind of career. It's almost like the best of both worlds, because I get to work with young people every day, but I also get to do it in a really different environment to a classroom or school or formal educational.
Yes, there is a great advantage to the school trip. It gets you out of the school, out of the classroom. The kids are excited. They've got their lunch with them that day. There's a journey to be made. And it is the great fun of the school trip. And of course, the museum itself, that really struck me. It surprised me so much over the years. I've took them to theatres, to museums, to art galleries and so on. But particularly, in all of those places in a way, you would again and again and again, or I would again and again and again, encounter students who'd never been to a theatre, never been to an art gallery, never been to a museum before. And they would wander around and they would, particularly with museums, and say, well, is this free? Can we just come here anytime? Such a wonderful resource.
They can be quite intimidating buildings as well, a lot of them are quite older buildings. And if you've never stepped foot in a museum, it can be quite the experience. And we're so lucky in this country that we have national museums, and the majority of our museums are free.
Yes.
And I'm a firm believer that, everyone has the right to engage with our national collections and our cultural material that we hold. And, because if you go to museums abroad in Europe or America, for example, you often have to pay quite a significant entry fee, and that's a real barrier. We're so lucky. So any teacher that brings a school into a museum or gallery is highly commendable in my eyes.
And even as you say, if it's just to say, this is here, and you can come back. When you're grown up, when you bring your own kids, this is a thing that's for you. And because when you are paying a reasonably high fee to get into a museum, like you in Rome somewhere, it changes your attitude. Now I must spend hours here and think about it. Whereas the other day I popped I met my daughter in London, and we went to the Natural History Museum, and we looked at the photograph exhibition. That actually did cost to go in there. But, you thought, well, you got in, you've seen one thing, you've enjoyed it, and you've left. You can't really do that.
And those, hopefully those museums they're not going anywhere. They usually open 7 days a week, permanent displays, and not just in London, across the country. But if you've never set foot in one, why would you think to do that? So that's why I think when teachers do go to the tremendous effort of organising school trips to museums, you're investing in our visitors of the future.
Investing in our visitors of the future. That's such a great phrase, and a good place for us to take a break now for the Teachers Talk Radio sponsored message. You are listening to the Friday morning break here with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio, with my guest this week, Claire Lawler from the Imperial War Museum. Join us again in a couple of minutes.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalized timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Bet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting-edge edtech companies and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
Now, you mentioned, I'll go back to that thought I nearly had before, which is programs. How would you say you develop different kind of programs for different audiences, and what's some examples of those sort of things?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the stipulations of the program itself. So, for example, sometimes it might have funding associated with it. And I'd say the audience specificities are what really kind of underpin the program. So, for example, I had, the tremendous honour of working on the new permanent Holocaust galleries here at IWM London. And as you will know, as many of your listeners will know, the Holocaust is the only compulsory subject on the history curriculum at Key Stage 3. So providing a learning programme, a learning session for our Key Stage 3 visitors, it's a really kind of essential part of what the museum can do and can offer support to teachers. So that's a very specific example, and we were fortunate enough to work with a variety of schools from across the country as those stakeholders. They are key stakeholders in the development of this programme. So in how we work at the museum is we kind of work alongside them and we test ideas with them, and so many teachers gave up their time to help shape the programme, and I'm just so grateful to them because they made it what it is. Because if we're producing something that, we think is good, but we've not actually tested it on the audience themselves, it's ultimately for them. So that's kind of a very specific example of a programme. But a programme could also be, a self-led resource around a temporary exhibition gallery. Right. It could be a digital learning resource. It can take many, many different kind of forms and iterations. But I would say the audience is key. Who is it for? And will it be useful for them?
Right. Fascinating. So what would you say? I mean, I've taken, in the early stage of my career, I'll acknowledge this, taken groups to museums and it hasn't been successful. We didn't, we haven't contacted the museum particularly well in advance. We've sort of turned up and students have wandered around. Some have sat and you find them sitting, looking a bit bored somewhere, and you try and encourage them to go places. What would you describe as a success, the way a teacher can make a trip to a museum or art gallery successful?
Yeah, I think you've kind of nailed it really in terms of the organisation. I think organisation is absolutely paramount to a successful trip, and getting the logistics right will make your life much easier on the day. And there is so much, and doing a bit of homework really, because there is so much out there in terms of support. So if you're interested in visiting a museum or gallery, go on their website, have a look. They'll have, risk assessments, they'll have FAQs, they'll have contact details. So if you want to reach out and talk to anyone beforehand, if you can, I'd highly recommend doing a pre-visit, just so you familiarise yourself with where you're visiting. And also, again, if you can, the most successful trips I've seen that teachers do is when they incorporate wraparound learning. So it's not just this kind of, spontaneous trip out. You've prepared your students beforehand. You've maybe set them a pre-visit task, and on the day they'll come in with that focus. And granted, I'm fully aware of timetable restrictions and the many pressures that are on teachers in terms of just the time available, particularly secondary schools. If you're taking a school that has a knock-on effect on the rest of the timetabling of your school.
Yeah.
But if you can, it just means that wraparound learning just means it feels coherent and relevant to what they're studying back in the classroom. So if you can do kind of a post-visit lesson, or even if it's just a recap, that can be really successful in terms of just having an impact on students' engagement with museums.
I certainly learned some of the lessons you've just described there over the years the hard way of realising that a museum can't be sprung on students out of the blue.
Yeah.
And they had to know what they were looking for and so on. And it got better as I got. There's so many things in teaching do. As the years went by, and I'd been to that museum myself a number of times, you could set them up for it. You'll see this, you'll look for this, and this is how it fits in with what we're studying.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
As the national curriculum evolved and things pop up, and you mentioned the Holocaust education is compulsory. How does that? I mean, that shapes the museum clearly because you've got money related to Holocaust education. But does the museum itself also reflect that? You think, well, there are different interpretations now, or different skills that the students are. They're probably two different things, but different skills the students are required to know. So we should. For instance, I'll think of a theatre. When I worked in Stoke-on-Trent, a local theatre would always check what the A-level texts were. They said, right, we better put Henry IV on Shakespeare. Well, let's do an adaptation of Inspector Calls, because we'll know we'll get the kids in. You know? And it'll be not commercial reasons, but just that was clearly going to relate to their studies. So do you say to yourself, well, this season we should emphasise this because this is what schools are going to be interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that's different for the primary curriculum, but also, later on at Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, which exam board schools are taking. So it's something we really, really monitor throughout the year in terms of just, not only kind of utilising and capitalising on those particular trends, but also ensuring we're doing our job. We have a responsibility to, offer support to schools and teachers and learners. So it's our responsibility to kind of stay on top of those trends. And an example of that is in terms of like anniversary programs, so key anniversaries. So for example, this year, we had the D-Day anniversary, and next year we'll have the anniversary at the end of the Second World War. So our programs will aim to reflect that, because that is what, teachers will potentially be focusing on in the classroom. Anniversaries are a really kind of useful way in, I think, to kind of key moments in history. So that's another example of how we would kind of try to capitalise on that, much like, the theatre would.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I noticed over the years is museums got a lot more interactive. We were talking before we started recording about my taking a group to the Winston Churchill bit that is connected to the Cabinet War Rooms.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I've ever been in such a technological museum. It was extraordinary, the things that could be done. And of course, that's the other thing, is museums were once things in cases that you looked at, and if you were lucky, there was a little card saying what it was. And over the years, are you involved at all in the sort of, the ways the museum is curated so that they can be interpreted by younger people?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's where we can work directly with our audiences to test things out. So I think a really good example of this, again, is going back to the Holocaust Learning Programme that we have here at IWM. The previous Holocaust exhibition, it had a really successful learning programme associated with it, and we would often get, repeat schools that would visit every year without fail. But the programme itself was an audio guide. Now, 20 years ago, audio guides, they were the norm, and I personally love an audio guide, but digital technology has advanced since then. Yes. But also we need to invest in our kind of infrastructure that we have for our learning sessions, because we've got to think strategically, particularly with budgets. So in terms of developing the programme, we wanted to have a digital element to it. So now when students visit the new Holocaust galleries, they go around in smaller groups and they have a specially designed app on a tablet that helps guide them through. Because, an audio guide, it's quite a singular experience. You're not really questioning, you're going around in silence. And we knew with the new interpretation of the galleries, that just wouldn't quite aligned. So with the kind of transformation of the Holocaust galleries, the learning program had to transform also. But also in terms of just like a really practical thing, it's much easier, if an object goes off display, it's much easier for me to just send an email to our app developers to say, can you take this bit out of the app, than it is to re-record a whole audio. So
Yes.
there's kind of different kind of stipulations and considerations when producing programmings, particularly around the interpretation, as you say.
Brilliant. And so describe to me how the app how the tablet works. The students get a tablet or they...
They do. Yeah,
Wow.
They do. And then we let them loose in the galleries. But we're very fortunate that we have, and most museums that you'll visit will have kind of dedicated learning centres. And we're very fortunate here at IWM London that we have two. We have the Claw Learning Centre and the Towby Holocaust Learning Centre. So we have a dedicated space for Holocaust learning, which is just so, I can't tell you. Again, it's like going back to that logistical thing. We've got this whole space just for schools. It's got every kind of all the amenities, that a school may need, and a dedicated space that they can use before their visit, also after their visit. But something I was really keen to kind of enable for students was them to not only confidently engage with museum interpretation on their own or within their groups, but also to confidently engage with the history of the Holocaust. And that's it's quite a big ask, particularly if they've never visited a museum before. But when you visit the Holocaust galleries, you'll understand those. And one teacher who we consulted with said, these spaces are clearly designed for conversations. You can't be silent around these spaces. You want to question. And I'm a firm believer in terms of, developing your understanding about a topic and your empathy about a topic, particularly one such as the Holocaust. You need to be able to ask questions about it. And so how the app works is students go around the spaces in smaller groups. They're given a choice of specific things that they want to focus on. And then the device will kind of ask them questions throughout about what they've chosen and why. Why did, the curators put this object here and what does this mean? And hopefully, I kind of always say, if students leave with more questions than they came in with, then I've done my job. Because hopefully it's inspired them to go and continue their learning after they've left the museum and continue their own study in whatever subject it may be.
And it's like a sort of technological version of having someone standing with you. I walked around, a very middle class sort of thing. You walk around with your kids when they're young and you point at paintings and go, well, what do you think that is? And you tell them about it, so on, feeling all very virtuous. But knowing that what you're doing is helping them engage with something that is going to be otherwise just some odd-looking people in a picture. So having that tablet with them enables them to have a personal kind of experience. And I agree with you about the audio guides, depending on how they're done and how worthy they sound. A little bit of sound effect in the background and a voice telling you that lengthily. You can't, but you can interact with this. Basically, that's the word, isn't it? Interact.
Yeah, precisely. And I remember one teacher when we were developing it, she was so concerned that her students weren't looking at the tablet the whole time, that they were in the galleries. And I was like, no, that's the point.
Yeah.
If it's encouraging them to engage with the interpretation of the galleries, that's the point. And also, I always used to think with an audio guide, they look like they're listening, but they could have easily have just pressed pause. You don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking as you were talking there about the way in which museums have changed. I remember going to the museum in Stoke-on-Trent of sort of pottery and things of that kind of stuff. Yeah, this is going to be exciting. The Museum of Pottery. But what they've done is they developed a Victorian street. You walk down it, of the sounds of things. It was a few years ago. And there were also the smells. And I thought, whoa, you have produced, if that doesn't smell like a Victorian street, I don't know what does. It was a truly pungent pong. And the students remembered that. It was like stepping into the past.
Yeah, we often have conversations about this in the museum with my colleagues around. You could visit that museum of pottery and you will have read an interpretation label about a particular ceramic piece, for example, but all these years later, can you remember the date? Can you remember who made it? Can you remember any of the specificities of it? But what you can remember is how you felt when you were in that museum. And we often have conversations here about the affectiveness of museums, and you remember just the physical presence of being in a space, particularly for students being in a public building that's not their school, and how they felt about it. And it's really lovely and really funny, actually. Whenever I say to anyone I meet, where I work, people will often go back in their memories, say, oh yeah, I went there on a school trip and I remember this. And that's what, I spoke about it briefly at the start, creating these really long-lasting, memorable experiences for students. And you've just summarised that there with your visit to the
and that debate that goes on in education among teachers is the content-heavy nature of our teaching, and you think and the necessity to deliver that content. They must know this, they must acquire these skills, which can push aside some of the time the sort of sense of wonder, the sense of I used to take it. I taught politics A level for years, and we'd go on a trip to various places, Parliament, sometimes if we were lucky, Washington DC, and years later I'd see someone in their 30s, early 40s, been teaching them. They say, Mr. Gibbs, there you are, you taught me. I have no idea who they were. And I go, absolutely. I'll pretend I knew them. And of course, yes, of course. And they say, well, that trip we went on, wasn't that amazing? That was that one where you got stuck on the train and the thing. Oh, yeah. And that's great to get into on the trip. Yeah. And that's, well, of course, as you say, that's what we remember from school. And my own belief is, I think what you're implying there is that if you can give them a sense of wonder, then that'll carry with them more than the date in which the act of succession or the something else that they might need to know for an exam.
Yeah. I mean, I commend any teacher that takes a group to a museum or gallery, but particularly one abroad. That is real dedication. But as you said, it's had an impact on them later on in life. And I also kind of consider, going back to a previous question around what makes a trip successful, is that it's not a day off for teachers. If anything, it's harder than a day in school.
Thank you for that. Yes, it is.
Yes. I think there's, not obviously, it could be because it is out of the norm. You're not in your familiar environment of a classroom or in the school. And it's much, much harder, and you've got to really be on your toes. And that's why I kind of said, if you get the logistics right, that means you can then focus on, your learning outcomes or what it is you hope the students will achieve. And also kind of bringing along other staff or support staff, I would say, having those people there makes your life easier as well, particularly if they're not a teacher that doesn't teach history, but you've had come to, help support with the ratios or whatever. Briefing them, because once they're kind of secure and know what they're doing, they can then disseminate that with the students and help focus them on their trip. So I always think it's hard. It's not a day off.
Indeed. If anyone has, as many listeners to this might experience, taken a little sort of a crocodile line, is it a line of students of year 7s or something through a busy street, just that alone, you age by several years as you do that. I remember being in Washington, D.C. This was sixth formers. And I was like, keep together, follow me. And we turned a couple of corners. We arrive at the Congress building and the end of the queue had gone. What? They can't have done. Where have they gone? Oh, they went into McDonald's back there.
Oh, gosh, that would. But then again, you're kind of, as I'm sure that was incredibly stressful at the time, but again, it's giving students that agency. I remember, because I worked previously at the National Portrait Gallery and I programmed a sixth form study day. And I remember one of the teachers used it as an opportunity for the students to practice going home by themselves. Now, the National Portrait Gallery is literally in Trafalgar Square, central London. And that is a huge deal. And a really formative experience for them, and that level of trust that she was putting in her students. And they came up and met her, and, they all successfully made it back home. And it's something as well that really strikes me, particularly with special educational needs schools who use museum and gallery trips to just help students practice those life skills that they might not necessarily get the chance to otherwise. So I remember I worked with a wonderful SEND school, and the teacher had a specific request that the students could practice getting to the learning centre in the lift. So knowing which floor to go to, which button to press. And it's those life skills that you kind of take for granted when, you're old, but you're old like me.
Yes.
But they can have, really formative experiences. And I always think the trip doesn't start when they step foot in the museum. The trip starts when they leave school. And you don't know what kind of journey they've had to get there. Yeah. So, yeah.
I absolutely. I remember the feeling when I was quite a bit younger, in junior school or something, going off to somewhere like a museum, and the teacher saying, "Right, I'm here. This is the entrance. Don't go out there. That's the street. But now explore the whatever." And we can just sort of go off. And that feeling. I've never thought of that. That feeling of being this place is a safe place, and yet somehow also I can explore it as well. And especially it might be because there's a lot of indications that these days parents are much more helicoptery, programmy than they used to be, and students often don't have the experience of exploring places like that. So they're not taken, or having freedom to do it themselves.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I came across with what happened to me, I remember being in a museum at some point with younger students, and they're all together, right? This is you've got your worksheets. We're going to do such and such at 3:00. Don't forget this. Get your timing. Have you got your lunches? We're going to the lunchroom. All this stuff, and then off they go, and they crowd around something. And there were members of the public who clearly come in to look around the museum, and suddenly all these young kids come up. And they're not being very quiet because young kids aren't very quiet, and they're being very enthusiastic, and they're pressing all the buttons madly and things of this kind. And I thought, I felt a bit guilty. Is there a sense in which the museum sometimes finds there's a tension between we are for the public, not just for kids, and we're also for someone who wants to quietly contemplate the beauty of some painting without a large group? Do you feel that sometimes we think, can we create a non-school space or just a dedicated school space?
Yeah, and most museums do have dedicated learning spaces, but to my mind, why should museums replicate what you can do in the classroom? Why, how is that going to encourage teachers to go through the tremendous effort of organising a trip to do something they could just do in school? So that's why whatever programming I try to do, I try and make an element of it within the museum, precisely why they visited. And yes, I guess you could argue that there is perhaps maybe a tension with other visitors, but actually I think it's that tension that makes museums incredibly agile and dynamic spaces. And I think having those clear aims and giving students a clear focus to their visit, so they're not just, sporadically going around and, engaging with lots of things, they've got a clear focus to what they're doing. I think if other visitors can see that, then, I would sincerely hope they would only ever encourage them to do that. And I've seen it so many times, there's nothing more kind of heartening when you see, particularly when I was at the National Portrait Gallery, seeing primary school children in their little high-vis vests, sat around a Tudor portrait of Henry VIII, the only one that exists. You're never going to see this anywhere else. And they're just so engaging with it and sketching with it. Visitors can't help but just think, what a wonderful thing that is, seeing these young people engage with this. And I absolutely believe that those different audiences that museums cater for can coexist in the spaces.
It's Friday the 17th of January and you are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Claire Lawler, Programs and Network Manager at the Imperial War Museum. We are discussing how to make the most of a museum visit. Join us again after a message from our sponsors and the Teachers Talk Radio news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalised timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Pet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting-edge edtech companies and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports on the impact government's decision to cut the Latin Excellence programme heads say will have on the poorest pupils. According to the article, many heads believe that the scheme has helped put state school pupils on an equal competitive footing for when they go to sixth form and university, and that the decision to cut it is disappointing. The LEP was created in 2021 to broaden access to Latin under then Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, after a 2020 British Council survey found that just 2.7% of state schools offered the subject compared with 49% of private schools. The decision to axe the scheme was made clear to schools just before Christmas, with the programme set to end in March. Head teachers have said that the mid-year withdrawal is particularly challenging, as schools may not be able to continue the subject until the end of the academic year due to funding squeezes. The response from heads follows comments made in December by high-profile historians and classicists, such as Tom Holland and Mary Beard. A Department for Education spokesperson said that the independent curriculum and assessment review will make sure all pupils benefit from a curriculum that delivers excellence. The BBC covers news that England's largest education union is voting on whether to accept or reject the government's pay offer of 2.8%. If the offer is turned down, the union will debate at its conference in April whether to hold a ballot for industrial action. The NEU has called the pay recommendation extremely disappointing. A Department for Education spokesperson called the union's response an extraordinary decision. NEU General Secretary Daniel Kebede said that the unfunded proposal was an insult to the profession and that it would lead to cuts to staff or resources or both. The ballot will open on March the 1st and will run until mid-April. The School Teachers Review Body, an independent group for teachers' pay, will recommend a formal pay offer later this year. In a separate dispute, tens of thousands of students in sixth form colleges across England were disrupted by strike action in the last week, as 2,000 NEU members staged a 3-day strike over pay. The September pay rise did not include teachers at sixth form colleges, as the Department for Education says they are responsible for setting their own pay. In Northern Ireland, some schools are to provide magnetic pouches to pupils so mobile phones can be stored during the school day. BBC Northern Ireland features comments by school leaders on the plan, which it is hoped will help pupils reduce the temptation to access devices during the day. Pupils have also responded to the scheme, with many saying positive things whilst acknowledging the challenges they may face. The plan was first proposed by Education Minister Paul Givan, but initially faced criticism over cost and issues around pupils' rights. Finally, as the cold snap begins to wane and forecasters start to talk about warmer temperatures on the coming days, many news outlets have covered the impact of the decision to close schools that can have on head teachers. Many have taken to social media to explain how the decision to close, or not, has affected them with some describing it as awful and really stressful. Schools across the UK have faced challenges in returning after the Christmas break due to the weather, with some being affected by snow and ice, some by heating issues, or, after a thaw, even flooding. One head teacher told BBC Radio that as schools have become less localised, problems have increased. We used to be able to walk to school, but now both staff and children can travel longer distances to come to school. Another head talked of the difficulty in arranging the curriculum to suit online learning for a period of time, despite experiences of this during the pandemic. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
When you're presenting a museum or an art gallery to students, do you sort of reveal to them not only this is a place of wonderful things, but it's also it got different roles as well. It's got a gift shop. It's got a cafe. It's a tourist place. It's a place where we keep things like heritage work, for instance. Here's the thing: we preserve things so they don't get lost. And so, and also, what exactly is it that the museum is doing? So, for instance, I don't know whether you've encountered a question like this. If a student ever asks you, shouldn't we give these things back to places? Or why have we got this? It's probably less clear with the Holocaust Museum, Holocaust stuff. But clearly there's a debate around, the Elgin marbles or things of that kind. In other words, there's that sense in which these, maybe more so with the portrait gallery, this is a treasure house of stuff. Why is it kept here? And why have we got it?
Yeah, like what the role of museums and galleries is, and I often refer to it as, the hidden work. And we're so fortunate here at IWM in particular because our learning centre has internal facing windows onto staff areas. So you can see real museum workers, work. And a question I often get asked with students is, how did you just get all this stuff? How did it come to be? And I think when teachers, visit a museum and they book a learning session, they're almost kind of going behind the curtain in a way, and revealing certain, museum practice and museum pedagogy. And, that could be anything around collections and how we acquire objects. And I think particularly at IWM, there's kind of the assumption that a lot of things are lovingly donated. But if you're a curator and, you've got a gap in your collection, you might have budget, you might be able to buy something at auction, just how do museums function? And there's kind of a careers element to that. I mean, that's particularly for, higher age groups, key stage 4 and up, perhaps. But, why do these places exist? What is their role? What is their function? And, the preservation, particularly of historic objects, so that future people can engage and learn with them and learn from them and our cultural material. So yeah, it's absolutely something we can highlight with students when they visit.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The way in which museums would have once had a strong sense in which we are British and this is our stuff. Telling the sort of national story, and were founded, and also founded in a way of being places to elevate the minds of the masses. There would have been this is great. This is the great and good stuff, and you can think outside of your. It's enculturating. There was something of a civilizing aim for museums at one time. So now they're much more diverse sort of places, aren't they? Museums. They are. And how do they keep up with the changing diversity of our population in the UK? For instance, there's going to be people who say, "Well, I don't know that what about the kings and queens of a country that I'm more identified with, or what about the or different views of history?" For instance, the National History Museum tells, for a sort of Winston Churchillian sense, it tells the story of the British people kind of thing. But you get to the lower levels, and now it tells the story of us right now. It's a very different kind of message.
Yeah, I would say it's something that museums and galleries and sites of cultural heritage are constantly thinking about, and how can we reflect, our society to today. And there's multiple routes into that. For example, collection strategies. Are there gaps in our collection? Do we need to acquire new objects? interpretation strategies, and whether there's that famous phrase that history says more about the time in which it was written rather than the time in which it's written about.
Yes.
So I often see museums and gallery interpretation as it's a historical interpretation in itself, and that's something particularly at the National Portrait Gallery, which has just undergone a huge transformation in its interpretation and its complete rehang of the collection, to make sure that our portraits that are on the wall reflect the society in which we live in today. And actually it's had an overwhelmingly positive response from visitors. But one of the ways we can kind of make sure we stay on top of things is that we're very fortunate to have very dedicated academic advisory boards, academic advisory panels, those stakeholders, like I mentioned earlier, to talk to us and tell us, what are these current trends in the research? How is it, developing? And how can museums and galleries bridge that gap to what is being discussed in terms of academic research to the public understanding, and how we can support particularly teachers and students in engaging with relevant topics to today. Because I would say this as someone who studied history. When you study history, it helps you understand the way of the world today and also your place within it. And I think museums and galleries can be vessels for that understanding through its interpretation and through its programming.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Understanding the present through looking at the past. Yes, absolutely. And that. I was thinking the other day, I was watching Wolf Hall. Oh, by the way, anyone who hasn't been to the Portrait Gallery since it's been revamped, definitely go. It's spectacular.
You can meet them, yeah.
Definitely go. I was watching Wolf Hall, and one of the things in Wolf Hall is that Thomas Cromwell is now a bit of a nice guy. And when I was at school, he was not a nice guy. He's the man who dissolved the monasteries and all those sort of things. He was a villain of the piece. And that shifting way in which we can interpret characters, especially when you were at the National Portrait Gallery, did you have a sense in which, well, some people say this about this guy, and some people say this, and the painting itself suggests the portrait of Cromwell is a little bit, well, he looks like a shifty character, and you think, well, is this? Was that something, that changing interpretation, that was something reflected? We need to update the panel next to the picture, or we need to change them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of how we engage students with those portraits is really kind of underpinning the pedagogy around them, particularly with the Tudor portraits, and using those as historical sources, primary sources, and the context in which they were made, because obviously only very wealthy people could have a portrait made. It would take, it would be a real investment of your time, and what you chose to have within that portrait of yourself is a really key indicator in terms of what, your motivations were as an individual. So we try and really encourage students with their close looking skills, their approaching portraits as historical sources and seeing what objects are there, what's in the background, what clothing are they wearing, particularly with Tudor portraits, and the jewellery and the pearls. Well, how did they get those pearls? Pearls come from the sea. Who would have dove in and got those pearls? Perhaps, yes. With the Tudor expansion across the world and the beginning of, you could argue, the beginning of the slave trade, getting them to think about not only the person within the portrait, but the world in which they live in, and perhaps what the portrait can tell us, who's missing from the portrait.
Yes,
and particularly, with Thomas Cromwell, it's an interesting one, particularly given his background. He grew up in Putney and he was elevated to such high status to the point where he had a portrait commissioned, and then copies of that would have been made. So it's kind of thinking of portraits almost as propaganda as well, particularly at that time.
Wow, it is. That's a fascinating thought. What was your? I'm just going to pick up on one thing you said there. That idea, of course, that what much of our study of history is the fascinating thing is what's not there. These are the most famous. These are the rich, and the kings and queens and princes tend to get a lot of coverage, but the ordinary folk often disappear from history. So is there a sense in which, I know I've noticed it over the years, we're going around National Trust properties or being in museums, that women have been brought back into history much more. Children have been brought back into history much more, and ordinary working people brought back into history. Do you think that's an ongoing thing, or do you think we're still rather it's the kings, the queens, the generals, and the battles that tend to dominate?
Yeah, I mean, they are obviously a part of the history. We can't ignore those, but I think particularly with the National Portrait Gallery, what is so fantastic there is that they have a really kind of clear, defined purpose and vision for what they want to be. And it's a gallery of people, for people. And, a tremendous amount of work has gone into the rehang and reflecting society, particularly with that gender balance, as you say. We've achieved that with the rehang. That wasn't the case previously. So that it can, truly reflect not only historical times, but also contemporary portraits. So, they have a commissioning program and a collections development strategy so that they can constantly add to it. So, there is a heightened awareness that, galleries and museums have a responsibility for that. But I also acknowledge, and I think, the sector itself acknowledges that, there's still a huge amount of work to do, and that, very dedicated members of staff are working towards to help collections and exhibitions reflect the way
it's something
we
you can't
live today.
escape in a way. I mean, the rich did paint portraits that are wonderful of them. Have them painted of themselves are wonderful, and the jewels and things are fascinating. And whereas the ordinary poor didn't leave much behind.
Yeah,
unfortunately, they do disappear from history. So and of course, when you go to a museum, you do want. I mean, it's like taking people to the Tower of London, and you say, well, I want to see the crown jewels. Why? Because they're massively, gaudily tremendous. So there is that sense again of the favourite things. What are the things at I'll go with the National Portrait Gallery first. What are the things that you think the ones that, and they all crowd around the Tudors, obviously, but what are the things that you wish that teachers made more use of or went to see? Your sort of hidden favourites.
I guess it depends on, what you're studying, what specific subject you're studying, but there is a really fascinating portrait which many of your listeners might already be familiar with, and that is a portrait of Queen Victoria. And it's in a room at the National Portrait Gallery, which is entitled Empire and Resistance. And the portrait is called The Secret of England's Greatness. And if you go have a look on the collections online on the National Portrait Gallery, you'll understand the kind of composition of this portrait. And it's Queen Victoria gifting a Bible to an ambassador who, is dressed in a completely kind of elaborate, exotic dress from Africa. Yes. And it's kind of using this portrait is, a complete imperial fantasy. And it's again thinking of portraits as propaganda. This scene never happened, but with the height of the empire, it's huge when you see it as well. And the frame is so imposing around it, you can't miss it. And it really kind of takes you back. And it's a way into dissecting that portrait can be a way in to really, really complicated and challenging and difficult history. But that's the beauty of, our national collections, is that you can use that cultural material as a conversation starter, as a way in to discussing, really kind of meaty topics. For example, the history of the British Empire.
Goodness me, yes, I want to go I want to be a teacher again and take some kids to see that. I do. It's a good where to start with a painting like that. That would be wonderful. And I can't think that I've seen it. I can't think. Yeah, that is wonderful. Thank you for that.
And when you find out it never happened, it's completely made up, but it was replicated, reproduced. You could buy it as postcards and kind of, trying to promote the empire at home and the good that the empire, the perceived good that the empire was doing. Whereas now, through a 21st century lens, we can see it in a very, very different way.
Oh yeah, wow! And the exhibition area is called Empire and Resistance.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't always called Empire and Resistance. So there would be there's probably a changing interpretation of the British Empire.
Exactly. So that portrait was on display with the previous rehang. So we've not taken it off display, but we have reinterpreted it with kind of, again, thinking of those current trends in research, current thinking. And as I said, it's been really well received. It's people appreciate and understand that. And I think visitors, can acknowledge those different interpretations.
That's brilliant, Claire. Thank you so much for that. And we're coming to the end now, believe it or not. And for this discussion, it's been fascinating. I makes me want to go to museums. I went to London the other day with my daughter. We went to the Natural History Museum, and then we went to first of all we went to the V&A, the Natural History Museum. She said, "I want to see the photograph exhibition of wildlife." I thought, to be honest, I thought, "Oh, you do, I don't." It was wonderful. It was so brilliant, backlit, perfectly crisp, extraordinary high quality things. And that's how I think what museums can do is so surprise you with things you didn't think you'd be interested in, the things you sort of come across by accident. So my last question, Claire, is can you do the same for the Imperial War Museum? What should we not miss when you're taking a group there? Put you on the spot.
I mean, any of your listeners that have stepped foot through any of the 5 sites of IWM. So we have IWM London, we have IWM North up in Manchester, but we've also got historical sites as part of our kind of umbrella of IWMs. That includes the Churchill War Rooms, as you mentioned previously, but we've also got IWM Duxford in Cambridgeshire, an airbase there. And we've got HMS Belfast, which is moored on the River Thames. So there's quite a lot to see.
There is. There is. I forgot about those. I've been to the Belfast.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to choose from.
Yes.
And I think there's something, that's one of the kind of joys, really, of working at IWM, is just the variety and diversity of our collection. We've got historic sites as part of our kind of branches, but also museums and interpretation as well. So, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're interested in, but I'm incredibly biased. So, I would say don't miss IWM London. And just, to be honest, I think it's just when you step through the doors and you see the atrium and we have, Spitfire hanging from the ceiling, a Harrier jump jet, we've got the V2 there, we're next to, a First World War. Just seeing the objects that were there at the time, particularly when they're on open display and they're not behind a cabinet. I think when you put an object behind a cabinet, and obviously some objects do need to be behind cabinets for conservation reasons, but when museums are brave and they put objects out on open display, just the proximity of being in the presence of something that was there at the time that you're perhaps studying, you can't beat that. You can't beat that sense of awe and wonder and that surprising nature, as you said.
Yes.
And so I would just say just visit and then see where your eye takes you.
Thank you. That's a great way to finish. And Claire, Lola, thank you for this discussion on the wonders of museums, which I'm happy to endorse completely, even with all the stress of Year 9s running off into the traffic and disappearing into the gift shop and never to be found again. So thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week has been Claire Lawler, Programmes and Network Manager at the Imperial War Museum. We also discussed the National Portrait Gallery and museums in general. And thank you so much, Claire, for that wonderful insight and rather inspiring insight into museums. If you wish to hear this episode again, you can find us on Spotify and multiple other platforms. That also brings to an end, for a while at least, my exploration of what schools are for. Listen back to this journey that I've made over the last 2 years here on Teachers Talk Radio if you wish to find out from past guests, experts, writers, academics and teachers something of an insight into the world of education and my bafflement as to what exactly we do in schools daily. It's certainly something very complicated, at the very least. Thank you for listening, and thank you for joining me for the last 2 years.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.